Alright, this is a 2000 Chevy Malibu with a 3.1 liter V6 engine. Belongs to my mother. I'm going to make a little video here talking about the problem that we had with the car, what I determined was causing the problem, and subsequently what I did to resolve it. So if you own a Malibu like this, or any Chevrolet car with the 3.1 V6 between the years of, say, 97 or 98 on up to probably 04, 05, and you experience any of the symptoms I'm about to mention, then stay tuned, because I'm going to show you what could very well be the problem, especially if you've got high mileage on the engine as well as other circumstances. So if you're experiencing hard starting, difficult to start the car, got to really crank on it to get it to fire, extremely rough idling whereby it lopes badly at idle, RPM range going up and down between, say, 500 and 1500 RPMs back and forth, tendency to stall at idle, come up to a light or intersection, or just sitting in the driveway, it stalls, poor fuel economy. You should notice it's using a bit more gas, quite a bit more gas in this car's case, a very strong odor of rotten eggs coming out of the tailpipe, and if your check engine light has come on and is providing you with 2 or more of the following codes. So if you did a code scan on your computer and you're coming up with either a PO300, which is a random multiple cylinder misfire, or a PO401, which is EGR flow insufficient. There was a third code, I don't remember exactly what the code was, but it essentially meant O2 sensor, sensor 1, bank 1 sensor 1, rich mixture detected. So if your car is experiencing any of the aforementioned symptoms, and you've got the check engine light and you've pulled 2 or more of the codes I just mentioned, the third one I didn't remember what it was, but the auto parts store or your book with your interface reader should be able to tell you what it is: multiple cylinder misfire, EGR insufficient flow, or O2 sensor, bank 1 sensor 1, rich mixture detected. Then you should pay attention, because this could very well be the problem. So before we go any further, let's talk about those individual problems as they are. Now, random multiple cylinder misfire can be caused by a wide variety of things. You could have spark plugs that are old, worn, failing. You could have spark plug wires in the same condition. Some cases the coil pack could be going out, but that's, in my experience, far less likely, because usually when a coil pack goes out, you've got like 1 or 2 cylinders that just continuously don't fire properly or at all. You could have potentially a vacuum leak. You could have a fuel injector that is no longer functioning correctly. Instead of spraying a fine mist of fuel, it could be spraying a jet, or not spraying at all, or leaking. Any of these kinds of things can cause a random multiple cylinder misfire, as well as a number of other things. So that could be a little tricky to track down. The O2 sensor, bank 1 sensor 1. Now, bank 1 sensor 1, that refers to the location of the sensor. Bank 1 is the cylinder head that has the number 1 cylinder on it. On the Chevy 3.1, this cylinder head on this side closest to the firewall has cylinder number 1. This cylinder right here is number 1. So bank 1 is this bank of 3 cylinders. Sensor 1 is the first sensor in the stream exhaust flow. That's the sensor before the catalytic converter. So if we look down here, I don't know how well this camera's going to pick it up, but here's the wiring to the new O2 sensor we put in. And down there, let's see if we can see it. Right there is the new O2 sensor. That's on the exhaust system before the catalytic converter. So bank 1 sensor 1, back side of the engine compartment, by the firewall, below the exhaust manifold, before the cat. Bank 1 sensor 1. And bank 1 sensor 1 rich mixture detected could be caused by a wide variety of problems, including everything that I've just mentioned. leaking fuel injector, overspray fuel injector, misfiring ignition system, not providing enough voltage to fully combust the fuel. I mean, just a number of things that can cause it. Now, EGR valve insufficient flow, as I have discovered through my research, is actually fairly common for the Chevy 3.1, and it does not necessarily mean that your EGR valve is bad and needs to be replaced. This is the EGR valve on this engine. The earlier Model 1s is in essentially the same location, but instead of mounting horizontally, as this one is, it mounts down here on the intake manifold and has an exhaust flow tube here that connects on the back side. The older Model 1s, like the 96 or newer, is in the same point, but it's more vertically or almost diagonal vertically mounted, and it's a wider base valve. But what it all boils down to is it doesn't necessarily mean the valve is bad. I managed to get this one to work again. It's a fairly simple process. Unplug it, disconnect the bolt down here. I think it's a 10mm that holds this EGR flow tube on the back, and then there's two bolts, one here and then one on the other side. Don't recall the size, but you'll need to remove the bolts and then pull the manifold, or pull the EGR valve off the manifold. Then get yourself a can of throttle body cleaner, not brake cleaner, throttle body cleaner only, and spray the port where the valve is, both sides, both the port side that mounts to the manifold and the side where the EGR flow tube attaches. Spray it out real thoroughly and liberally. Do not use any mechanical tools or instruments, as you can gall up and damage the valve, and then it will not work at all after that. Once you've got the valve itself cleaned with the throttle body cleaner, then spray the inside of the port going into the manifold using the same cleaner. And I used a piece of coat hanger wire about 4 to 6 inches long, just to probe the port. You're not really scrubbing or scraping or gouging or doing anything forceful. You're just making sure that the port is clean and not obstructed with carbonous deposits. And then soak it out real good with the throttle body cleaner. Then give it a good half hour, 15 minutes to half hour to dry. Throttle body cleaner is designed to evaporate and dissipate rather quickly. That's how it's designed. Then using a new EGR valve gasket, reassemble it, plug it back in, and you should be good. Of course, you'll need to use your scan tool to clear the code out of the computer. So that's about the EGR valve, and we've already discussed the O2 sensor and the random misfire. So now let's discuss what actually was the problem with this car and what could very well be the problem with your engine if you're experiencing the same symptoms. Okay, so this wasn't the problem, but I neglected to mention it earlier. This is just the O2 sensor that I already pulled at the insistence of my mother, since her car. About 50 bucks. The sensor's probably perfectly good. It was quite a bit dirtier than this, carbon covered, but that's really kind of irrelevant. You would probably need to use a O2 sensor removal tool to remove the O2 sensor should you actually have an O2 sensor related problem. You can rent them at many auto parts stores. They're like right at $30 to rent. You get your money back when you return it, so that's no big deal. But anyway, here's the actual problem. This was the fuel regulator. It goes on the car. It mounts onto the intake manifold just like that. The fuel line from the fuel pump comes in at the bottom here. You got a vacuum port stem here, and then the inlet that feeds the fuel into the fuel injection rail here. So I'll show you now where this regulator actually mounts on the engine. Okay, so there's the brand new shiny clean regulator attached to the intake manifold, and removal of it from the manifold itself is actually simplistic. It's just one bolt here that holds it on to this keyway, which is actually removable. The keyway slides into a groove on the fuel injection rail. It doesn't actually bolt to the manifold. It bolts to the fuel rail. Unfortunately, as easy as it seems to get this out, it's actually not quite as simple. In order to remove this, you have to remove the throttle body assembly first, because you cannot get a wrench in there to loosen this fuel supply nut right here. You can't get a wrench in here to turn. I mean, you can probably get a wrench on it, but you can't turn it. Everything's in the way. So you need to pull this throttle body off of the upper intake plenum in order to be able to remove the fuel line to the regulator. Air box has got to come out. That's just a couple of bolts. Disconnect the vacuum and electrical leads to the throttle body. Disconnect the throttle linkage and cruise control. This bracket assembly has to come off. All that snorkel has to come off. There's two rubber lines that connect to this coolant cross pipe that connects here, and then it wraps around, goes under, and there's two rubber coolant lines that connect with clip-on hose clamps. That needs to be come off. This pipe needs to be pulled away, so you will lose coolant. And once you get the air box, air snorkel, vacuum, and electronic components disconnected, moved out of the way. Of course, the linkages need to be moved out of the way there, and get this coolant cross pipe, and this hose needs to come out of your way so that you can get access to it. Then you just use a like a star tool, is what it was, Torx, to loosen this bolt. Of course, disconnect the vacuum and then pull it out. It's pressed in there rather tightly, actually. Just pull it out, wipe it down, grab the new one, throw a little bit of gas on the new O-ring on the one that you're going to put in there, and then push it into the end of the fuel rail. Reassembly is just the reverse of pulling it out. It's probably 30-40 minute process entirely to get it all said and done. And as soon as we had that regulator replaced, car runs smooth. Now, before this video gets too long, make it too long to upload, I want to show you how I discovered that the regulator itself is bad. So all you had to do, and I was doing a fuel pressure test on this car, thinking that I had possibly an injection problem. So I had to get a fuel pressure tester. This Schrader valve is not the easiest thing to get to because of this power steering line. So I was fussing with it, trying to get an accurate fuel pressure reading. I decided to start the car, and something told me to start the car, get it running, and then with the engine running, unplug this little vacuum line to the top of the regulator, knowing that it should alternate the engine operation upon doing so. Well, when I pulled that vacuum tube off there, I had fuel coming out of there, and that's a big no-no. There's a diaphragm in there, and you should never have anything but vacuum here. So that showed me immediately that that was where my problem was. The regulator wasn't working properly, and gas was making it past the diaphragm through this line, and then this line goes all the way down here and connects onto the back of the intake manifold behind the engine. And so this explains everything. The excess fuel consumption, gas was getting past the diaphragm through the regulator without going through the fuel injection system at all. Excess fuel on 1, 3, and 5, because that's where the hose plugs into the manifold, so it was giving extra fuel to those cylinders, which was causing misfires and rich mixture condition on O2 sensor bank 1, sensor 1, tendency to stall because it was essentially drowning out the engine. It was just pumping a lot of fuel down the engine, and the engine couldn't cope with it. Incidentally, the rotten egg smell that I mentioned earlier was the catalytic converter struggling to keep up with the overflow of fuel. So anyway, if you've got a 3.1, it's rough starting, tendency to die at idle, loping very badly at idle, lack of power, your mileage went into the tank, and of course rotten egg smell coming from the exhaust, as well as the check engine codes, PO300, random multiple cylinder misfire, and PO401, EGR valve insufficient flow. That's a carbon coating issue inside the EGR valve. Also, the O2 sensor, the O2 sensor one. Yeah, you probably got a bad fuel regulator. The regulator, it's about I think it's about 60 or 70 bucks. I don't really remember. I think it was like closer to 60 bucks, brand new at the auto parts store. But it was about a 30-minute repair, 45-minute repair, and the engine runs beautifully right now. Okay, so we're going to show you how the car runs now. It's Saturday morning. It's about 10:30 in the morning, and it's been sitting all night without running. Whereas before it would be difficult to start, really require substantial cranking to get it to fire, and then the tachometer, once the engine ran for about a minute, would start loping between the 2,000 RPM range and nearly zero. So let's see what it does now. Oh, quit it. Okay. Yep. Started right up, and it's hitting right around the 1,000 RPM range. Once it warms up, it'll drop down to about 800, which for this 3.1 is about where it idles. Right about now, before the repair, I would still be trying to start the car. I would still be cranking on it, just trying to get the engine to fire up. And I'm not detecting any of that. No rotten egg smell coming from the cat. Sounds good. It's running smoothly. It's running about like it did before the regulator went bad. So if you've got a Chevrolet car with a Chevy 3.1 V6 and you've got those symptoms going on, check that fuel pressure regulator, because that could very well be the cause of your problems. Thanks for watching.